Hello, wonderful people of the internet. It has arrived. My West Perthshire book is here. And today we're going to have a look at some of the differences between East Perthshire and West Perthshire, based upon the books. As you can see, I've scanned in some of the pages from the book, and now we can take a look at the different forms side by side to see which ones are similar and which ones are different. Now, right off the bat, I must say that I like the way that they have edited and formatted the new book. It's just a little bit easier to read for the most part. It doesn't have as much content as East Perthshire Gaelic, but it's, I think, based upon conversations from the 50s and the 60s, rather than conversations that the author themselves actually had with the informants. So I think that's why. Given that the book is aimed at people who I guess are linguists, and especially people who are knowledgeable of Gaelic already, the words are ordered from A to Z, but using the Gaelic rather than English. So, for example, you can see here a mesk or mesk, like that. Now, for someone like me, and I suppose other people who are trying to learn, it's a little bit difficult to try and find words, which is why I like to scan them in so that I can search for them as a PDF form. I don't, however, share the books with anyone else. They're just for me, just so that I can search for words that I need to use or find or want to learn, etc. So these books are probably a little difficult if you are just learning, which is basically my experience. I started off using East Perthshire Gaelic to learn most of my Gaelic. I had a slight bit of knowledge of Gaelic before I started, but it was nowhere near sufficient. It was still very beginner level. Now my Gaelic is a little better than it used to be. It's not perfect. I still have a lot of issues. I still have a lot of learning that I need to do, but I am slowly getting there. Anyway, let's dive into it. And the first thing I need to say is that I probably should have had the pages on the opposite sides of the screen. The reason for that is that the West Perthshire is on the eastern side of the screen, or I should say the right side of the screen, and the eastern side on the left. So it's maybe a little confusing. However, I will use my cursor here and maybe the zoom if I can figure out how to use. There we go. I will use them as much as possible. Now, the first thing we are looking at in this little review or comparison video is the, or an. In East Perthshire Gaelic, so this side, I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see a little bit easier. It has the form n, nt, nch, n with lenition, nothing, so no pronunciation with lenition, n with lenition, and n with an H. Now that H is often in front of vowel sounds. So for example, if it is a feminine singular, I believe, it'd be something like neglash. So you can see that the N actually connects to the following word. For some words, for example, that start with F, it actually becomes mver. So that F actually becomes a V sound. And then for something like sur, it actually becomes a Z sound, so nzur, which I think is pretty unique in terms of Gaelic. I don't know about other areas that have it. I know that in the east, so places like Perthshire or Strathspey, other places up north, etc., have the Z sound. But in the Hebrides or in Irish, etc., I don't remember ever seeing a Z. There might be one, I just don't remember it. So looking at the West Perthshire side of things, we see that the same tendencies from East Perthshire are found in West Perthshire. So the n, nd, nch, n with lenition, and the n with the H, and also the no sound lenition, n with lenition, And then there's also this form, which sometimes shows up in East Perthshire Gaelic as well, but it's not consistent. So looking at this one first, we can see here, nemished. So the weather. And it continues like this. So mbals, and mbany, etc. You can also see that the V and Z sounds, or Z sounds, carry over into the West as well. The form of the with broad vowels tends to be nt, so ndat, etc. And this form also carries over into the West, so ndurcher. And with the slender vowels, it is njim, for example, or njegel, and this also carries over. So we can see that there is a lot of crossover between the two, which makes sense because they're right next door to each other. So the zero sound with lenition that you would find in East Perthshire also shows up in West Perthshire. In standard, they would say the a, so it'd be something like a foch, a hiarach, etc. But in the east and west of Perthshire, and I'm not sure how far this extends, but it just wasn't said. They would write it, I'm sure, but I don't know that they would say it so often. Now, something that I find interesting is that some consonants change the n into a n in the singular. Now, I'm not sure if this carries over into other dialects or not. I know it happens in East Perthshire Gaelic. For example, nascuab or naslauri. And you can see that it also carries over into the West. For example, naspair or naspian. But I don't know if you find that in other places like Argyll or other areas of Scotland. Of course, with the plural, you also get forms like na, heich. This is also found in West Perthshire. Something that I've noticed, but I don't see any evidence of in this chapter anyway, is that in the West, they carried a lot more of the genitive forms than were used in the East. So, for example, the informant that I follow, that I have been crafting my language or creating my language based upon, I suppose. That sounds like I'm creating a conlang. I mean, like molding my own Gaelic to be like hers, I suppose. She very rarely used the genitive forms. Instead, she would just use the nominative. But some of the genitive forms actually became the nominative, which I find quite interesting. I can't think off the top of my head which ones were used and which ones weren't, but I do know that there will be a word with an I in it, which is not usually present in the nominative form in other dialects. So I find that very interesting. So the next one we're going to look at is what they would say in standard, I suppose, or mid-minch, aunen. So this form, as a full aunen, that pronunciation is almost never said, I suppose. Actually, yeah, very, very rarely do they say anything like that in the East. And in the West, there is that, what they call a diphthong. So it goes aun. So if we move over to the West here, we can see here, aun. So they do say it, but in the East, it is almost never said. Actually, I don't think it's ever said at all like that. There's no diphthong. It's always either an or on, as you can see here. So an, on. Now, my pronunciation is probably a little bit off because I'm not a native, so I probably get things wrong. So please forgive me if I make some mistakes there. But looking at this, you'll get an idea of it anyway. So often, the second part of it, you see here we've got annen. So it's kind of like two words put together. It's almost like in the, but it's not actually in the. But in East Perthshire, often that second is gone, or second an is gone. Instead, it just becomes an bien. Another note is that there is change, I think santi, in the words after an N sound in East Perthshire Gaelic. This also carries over into West Perthshire as well. We'll look at that later, but here you can see an bian rather than an pian. So the P becomes a B sound. This is also true when there is a slender consonant next to another consonant. That slender consonant actually becomes a broad consonant. So rather than being a j or a ch sound, it becomes a d sound. An example of that would be kudjigen, which would be said as kudgin. So the j becomes a d, and then the in front of again just gets deleted entirely and just becomes gin. So kudgin. So va kudgin gra, like that. Interestingly, the combined forms, for example, nam lao or nam lai, are not really used so much. Instead, it'd just be un malao. You do see here this informant uses un malai. So we do have some people remembering some of the genitive forms, but I think a lot of them had fallen by the wayside at this point. Now, sometimes you do see this last consonant being kept in pronunciation, but I don't think it was consistent. I think sometimes they used it and sometimes they didn't, but there was no rhyme or reason to it. At least that's the impression that I get. In the case of the first and second singular possessives, for example, num or nummo, that na is deleted entirely and it just becomes mo. So darvami mo fonach. And this happens with dot as well. So rather than being nud or nadot, it becomes just dot. When we look at the article, the main version that is used is ants, or in Glen Lyon, I think it's unts. So similar, that's just got a little bit of a different sound to it. But as you can tell, that seems to be the most common form that was used. And sometimes the second sound is kept, for example, uns and zol, but not always. We also see down here we have uns jarach for in the spring, but sometimes it was also just sjarach. So once again, I think some of these forms were kind of, I don't know, I'll just say this now and later I'll say something else. They had lots of forms to choose from. Looking at the West Perthshire side now, and it's pretty much the same pattern in a lot of places. Here we just have the singular or n, for example, mblar. Or here we have hangin. Or even here, gyaun. Once again, we have that N plus hard consonant like k or p becoming soft, so it changes the sound. They also seem to have used the second sound in this word in front of some words as well. But once again, I don't know whether this was a consistent thing or not. I don't know whether there was any rhyme or reason to it. One of the big differences between the two is that in West Perthshire, there was this form which elongates the N sound, so un something. Do we have an example of it? Oh, we do. Unfaska. So in shelter. But you've also got this aun, and this aun is much more common in places like the Hebrides or further west. We can see here something that's a little bit different to how it was used in the East. Num seems to be used, whereas in the East, when we go to the East here, it was just mo, darvami mo fonach. In the West, they would have said darvami nam fonach. Another difference we see is that rather than unts with the article, so in the, they used s, or sometimes sun. So I think I will leave this video there. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm intending to do some more videos like this in the near future. I might even do some videos about West Perthshire from the book. I'll try and base everything that I'm talking about off evidence from the books rather than trying to make up my own evidence, because that's not evidence at all. And I also have another gaming video coming out. I don't know if people are interested in that, but I find it good practice nonetheless. And I also have some more pronunciation videos that I'm going to release. Now, once again, all of the stuff that I'm doing is based upon what I find in the books, generally. Sometimes when I'm making game videos, some of the words that I use are guesses. Like, I will find a word in the dictionary, generally in... Oh, I forgot his name. Armstrong, in Armstrong's dictionary. Now, I know that his dictionary is quite old, but I know that he was from Perthshire. So I'm guessing some of the forms that I find in there will be in line with Perthshire Gaelic. Now, there's sometimes that I find a word and I simply don't know whether it was used, whether it wasn't used. Like, for example, I know that in East Perthshire, for weight, they'd say cujum. Now, a word for important is cujumach, whereas in the West, they'd say kudromach. And for weight, they would say kudrum. Interestingly, in West Perthshire, it seems to be kudrum. Kudrum. A bit difficult to say kudrum like that, I suppose. I'm not perfect. But because of that, I'm not entirely sure whether they use that, which they use, etc. I know that it's written in the dictionary. And sometimes I can find examples, like I look on Dusk, I think it is, that's a website, and I'll look at books from Perthshire and I'll find entries for some of these words, but I don't know whether they were used a lot, whether they were just like someone found them in another book and they decided to use them or not. Another word that I found not too long ago was the word furfi. Furfi, I suppose, would be the pronunciation, which means perfect. Now, realistically, that makes more sense given the changes that are in Perthshire Gaelic. Furfi sounds more likely than furf. The other option that would be something like just furf, but I don't have any evidence of that. I'm not a way to make up my own word. So I decided to use in the upcoming video that I'm making, or that I have made, I'm just editing it at the moment, the word furfi. But I don't actually know whether that word is correct or whether it was used in Perthshire or not. But, you know, because it's those gaming videos, they're not meant to be 100% correct anyway. So if I make a mistake in that sense, it's not bad. For videos like this, I'm trying my best to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes it's a bit difficult because I'm still learning a lot of things myself. But hopefully I'm getting as much as I can correct. And if people use this as sort of a jumping off point, that's okay. What I always say to people is don't ever use anything that I release as your only source of information for learning Perthshire Gaelic. If you want to learn Perthshire Gaelic, then yeah, fine, use this as a jumping off platform, but always research everything yourself, because I've probably made 100,000 mistakes, so it's always better to be safe than sorry. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Once again, I hope you enjoyed it. Please take care, be safe, and be well.